thank you so much, everyone, for returning back to my show. And for the few of you that haven't seen my last couple of episodes and the last 10 or 15 episodes, my show is about increasing awareness and exposure of local nonprofits, charities, fundraisers, and causes. You guys will not believe who I was lucky enough to have back today. I'm out of his schedule because he's super busy trying to get people off the streets. But Mr. Joel Adamson from Kitsap Homes of Compassion. And we've done a couple of episodes already where we got to touch on a teeny bit of the information that you have for us and that you want us to hear. So what I like to do is have you kind of refresh your mission statement for those that haven't seen the past couple of shows. And then we'll jump right into number 15. So we've been going down the list of questions that we want Joel to get out that he's written, by the way. And now we'll go from 15 and finish up the list. Okay. Or continue with the list, I should say. Okay. So let's go again briefly on your mission statement for the new viewers.
Yeah. For those that haven't been able to join us for the first two, our mission of Kitsap Homes of Compassion, which is at kitsaphoc.org, is our website, which has all our information, is to end homelessness in Kitsap County and to abolish homelessness. Essentially 95% of the chronically homeless. There might be 5% that might want to always be homeless, but 95% of the people on the streets don't like living on the street, and they really would like to be in a house or an apartment. And so our goal is to make that wish come true, and so that they can live a decent life and to their full potential. Because it's our belief at Kitsap Homes of Compassion that it is wrong and immoral to allow human beings to be living in the conditions they are living and eating out of trash cans on the streets. And so we're taking action to change that.
Well, okay. And let's see. So boarding houses and group homes are legal for single-family home zone neighborhoods in Kitsap County, Bremerton, and Poulsbo.
That's correct. Some people have a misunderstanding, or maybe they remember the old years, because many years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, there were zoning laws that said in a single-family neighborhood zoned area in Kitsap County, people living in the house had to be related by blood. They had to be relatives. But the county has updated their ordinances because first of all, we're in a military town. A lot of people come here, and a lot of Navy guys share houses together, and they're not related. So that really was an old ordinance. So people are allowed to live together who are not related. And Kitsap County updated the ordinance on boarding houses. It used to be to get registered as a boarding house, the house had to be located in an industrial or commercial area. But since approximately 2 years ago, they updated the ordinance allowing boarding houses to be located in single-family resident neighborhoods.
Okay. Nice.
And boarding houses are, by definition, are rooming houses, are houses that are rented out by the room, and the owner of the house does not live in the house. So what this means is this news and this information needs to get out to the population of Kitsap County, because a lot of home owners and a lot of renters, landlords of rental property, they're afraid to lease their property or rent their property by the room because they remember the old laws. But actually, by renting it by the room, they're actually creating more affordable housing for everybody in our county. And if more landlords and people who own second and third homes, if they would rent them out by the room instead of by the whole house together, the price is much lower by the room, and many more people can afford it.
Oh, good idea. Okay. So do you think that there's a stigma associated with the word mental illness?
Yeah, we talk about mental illness because related to homelessness, because a lot of people who are homeless are dealing with some mental illness issues, some psychiatric chronic disease, and there's been a lot of improvement in the stigma of it, but it's not. something that people should have stigma about. We should be able to talk freely and openly about mental illness, just like we talk about cardiovascular disease or any other liver disease or any other kind of disease we have in our body. Our brain is just an organ like any other organ in our body, and as an organ there can be failure and there can be it can be disease, and a lot of people just don't understand that. We seem to know a lot about a lot of diseases. We know about diabetes and a lot of these diseases, but the public seems to not really understand a lot about mental illness, about manic depression, about schizophrenia, about serious depression. We need to get rid of, the best way to get rid of stigma is to talk about it in a factual, scientific way, and so people don't need to be ashamed about it. Just if you have a cardiovascular disease, you don't have to be ashamed about that, and if you have a mental illness, you don't have to be ashamed about that. And their treatment is available, and in the last 10 years, my brother's a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and he's told me how they've come out with all sorts of new treatments and medications for many different types of mental illnesses. And so talking about it is the key. The problem is the mental health industry in the United States, they try to avoid stigma, and in trying to avoid stigma, they just try to not mention it, and not mention it with mental illness, with homelessness, because they don't want people to get, people have a bad idea of homelessness. They make wrong assumptions that everybody has criminalization, or everyone's on drugs or things, and so they don't want the word mental illness associated with it because they want to protect those people. And so, like I've seen a 2-hour documentary on homelessness in Seattle, for example, and the whole 2 hours, nobody, and the commentator or anything, never said the word mental illness in the whole 2 hours. That's not being really honest about dealing with the problem. We have to be honest with the public with information and not filter information. That's why I'm glad for public TV, so that we can talk honestly and openly about all of the issues that are involved, and so yeah, so I think there's a lot of improvement going on with mental illness and the stigmatization, and but there's ways that we need to go in that process, so the public gets educated about the disease, and so they can help one another and help their relatives. Statistically, we all probably have a relative who has mental illness, and I have a relative, close relative, that has disabling mental illness. And so the more we all can learn about this, the more we can help ourselves, we can help our families, and we can better deal with this and address all the issues.
Oh, nice. Okay. And so how is the care and housing for those with serious mental illnesses changed over the years? Do you think this has helped a lot?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, Dean, because how the United States, we have changed our policy on how we treat the seriously mentally ill drastically over the last 50 years.
Oh, so?
Well, let me go back 200 years ago to, 1776 we started our country, and back then in the 1700s, the people with mentally ill, coming out of the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages, people were just, they thought they were demon possessed. People would throw stones at them. They would laugh at them. It was not thought of as a disease. And they were ostracized, and it was a terrible situation. Then you get into the 1800s, the early 1800s in the United States. We did not have any psychiatric hospitals then, and people with extremely serious mental illness that were psychotic, they would end up in the prison systems. And the prisons had lots of people with serious mental illness in it, and it was inhumane, just terribly. You can imagine the prisons of 1800s, but plus the people with serious mental illness were being abused by criminals, because these people, most of them are not criminals, but they didn't have any place to put them, and they ended up in our prisons. Then a lady in 1840 who was married to a person who is in Congress went and she toured some of the United States prisons and said, this is completely inhumane that we have these people who have this mental illness, that they need to be separated from the criminals. And so from 1840, she appeared before Congress, and we started a campaign of building psychiatric hospitals between 1840 and 1965. And we built up over 500,000 beds in the United States in psychiatric hospitals. And people were taken out of the prisons and they were put in hospitals, and they did much better. Then we had a major change happen in 1965 with the Civil Rights Movement, and new lawsuits and things, and funding was coming tight, and basically it started the process of closing down the mental health the psychiatric hospitals happened. And today we've closed down over 90% of the psychiatric hospitals since 1965, and that has led to part of the problem we have today, because when someone needs a psychiatric hospital, there's not a bed for them to go to because they're all full, and the waiting list is so long. And this is a part of our history, and it shows the development of this problem of why we have seriously mentally ill on the streets of our cities and our towns. And it was not that way 40 years ago. They had a place, they had a roof over their head, they had 3 meals a day provided to them. Now we had problems, they weren't properly funded, and there were major problems with those institutions. Just because you have a problem with the institution, if they find a problem with Harrison Hospital, the decision isn't just to close down the hospital and put all the sick people on the street. That's not an appropriate solution to the problem. If you want to find out more about that, I recommend reading a book, Insane Consequences: How the Mental Health Industry Fails the Mentally Ill. This book, the author of this book has done a lot of research over the last 40 years of this institutions, and if you want to read the details, you can go to your library and get a copy of that book.
So now everyone has some reading to do. And we will be right back after this quick break with Mr. Joe Adamson from Kitsap, Homes of Compassion. And we will be right back. And welcome back, everyone, to my show, Charities. And today I was lucky enough to get Mr. Joe Adamson back from Kitsap Homes of Compassion. What we're going to do is continue the list that Joe wrote for us. It's number 18 of our questions. We'll kind of sum up what we talked about, and then on our next show, part 4, we will start with some fresh new information, continue on. So we will do number 18 as far as we can get, because I know this is a multi-part question, and we can go back to number 18 on our next show and kind of and redo it if you like. But so what are the causes of high rents and housing affordability problem? What do you think are the causes of such high rents?
Well, thank you, Dean. I think this is a key question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Welcome you back.
Well, thank you, Dean. This is a key question because as I mentioned, I think on the first show, I showed a graph showing that over the last 15 years, rents have been going up in Seattle and Kitsap County, but incomes have not been going up, and Social Security has not been going up like rents have. For example, rents have basically doubled in the last 15 years, but Social Security payments have gone up very slightly, and so that creates a gap, and it's forced many people into homelessness. People who are on fixed incomes, particularly people who are disabled and have small fixed incomes, forced into homelessness. And so in seminars with Washington's Department of Commerce and others, they've shown that graph, and they basically leave it at that it's because of the high rents that we have, homelessness, and but often people don't talk about why is it that we have such high rents?
Yeah.
Why is it that there's such a shortage of rental apartments and deeply affordable apartments? And often they do not talk about the disability aspect of it, that people who are disabled often need, in addition to an affordable home, they need a layer of supportive services, or someone comes to the house weekly to check on them and help them, that kind of services. So supportive housing is needed in addition to just housing alone. Housing alone will not solve the problem without that additional supportive layer for those that have serious disabilities. So to the question of why are the rents so high, it's, of course, they say, oh, supply and demand. There's a low supply and there's a high demand, and that makes prices go up. Yeah, that's obvious. But the question is then, why do we have such a low supply? Because if you look in history, in 1982 and the early 80s, there was plenty of supply of affordable housing all over the United States, including Seattle and Kitsap. We had plenty of affordable housing. That means affordable means that you can pay your rent with a third of your income, and you still have 70% of your income left over. But now that's not the case. Now the reason why, so something changed between now, this year, 2019, and the early 1980s. And that's what I want to talk about. What happened in that time, the answer to that question is, the quick answer is, we are not building as many rental apartments now per year, per 100,000 population, as we were in the 1980s. That's the short and simple answer. But I want to go into the reason of why are builders not building affordable housing like they were in the 1980s. But just to show you a graph, they're going to put on your screen there this graph that shows the thousands, and the left-hand column is the thousands of units of single-family homes. There's one graph, and multifamily housing that was built. Multifamily housing includes apartment buildings and condominiums. And these are from HUD statistics. And this graph shows from 1975 to 2013. And on this graph, if you're looking at the graph, you can see that first of all, there's a lot more single families being built homes than in multifamily homes, than apartment buildings. But you can see here in the early 80s, there's quite a few. There's between 600 and 700,000 being built every year of multifamily housing. But then it drops drastically it drops by 75% between then and 1990. What happened then was several changes in the laws happened. We had the 1986 Tax Act that radically changed financing and how people who, if you're building rental properties, how much you can use as a tax deduction. And they no longer allowed a lot of tax deductions for real estate that they used to. And so investors stopped investing in building apartment buildings drastically by 75%. But for housing, conversely, the government made all sorts of new rules that made it easier for people to get 30-year fixed mortgages at very low interest rates. And so you can see the graph for the single-family housing units went up. Yeah. So you can see, and the number of multifamily housings has never gone up to where it was in the early 1980s. So basically, we have been building every year less rental apartments year after year for 30 years. What do you expect will happen when you stop building apartment buildings? Rents are going to go up, supply goes down, demand is always there and increasing, and so rents are going to go up. It's a natural equation of economics, supply and demand. So the bigger question is, why is the government not encouraging more developers to build more affordable rental apartments? The government changed its focus to single-family homes and made all sorts of incentives. The The American dream is everybody to have their own house and single-family homes, and they made that part of the policy. And they're in our next session, I can go into the exact policy decisions that were made and the financing decisions that were made, making financing of single-family home construction very cheap and easy and affordable for developers and for buyers and home buyers, but for people who wanted to build multifamily apartment buildings, they did not provide, the government did not provide the same kind of financing. You can get a 30-year fixed mortgage if you want to buy a home, even today, but if you want to build a 6-unit apartment complex or 10-unit, the 30-year fixed loan doesn't exist. The 30-year fixed loan, there's no bank that will give you a 30-year fixed loan. The 30-year fixed loan is something that was created by Congress to encourage people to buy homes and to make it affordable. But they didn't create that same financing for the construction of multifamily housing.
Absolutely.
And so building housing is always a very expensive thing. It's rarely done with cash. It's usually done with financing. And if you do not provide financing, then it's not going to be built. And so this is a very complicated question, but the public needs to know, because the public needs to notify the legislature, the representatives, that we need more rental housing, and we need to provide more financing for those that are building this housing so that we can create more affordable housing. But I'll go into that next week. Also, they started in 1986 the low-income tax housing program for building quote-unquote affordable housing. But that is not necessarily always affordable. There was over a 200-unit affordable, quote-unquote, new affordable housing complex was built in the last 10 years in Silverdale. But you have to have an income of $33,000 a year to qualify to rent one of those apartments. But it's quote-unquote affordable, so if you made $100,000 a year, well, you're not allowed to rent an apartment there. But so therefore, you know, they have these rules of definition of affordability, but they have also rules of minimum income to be able to get in. You have to have 2.5 times the rent to be able to rent an apartment in that quote-unquote affordable housing complex. So just because they call it affordable housing complex, and it was paid for all by tax dollars by this tax credit program, but just because it's paid for tax dollars for affordable housing, it's not affordable enough for the people we're talking about, the people who are disabled and are homeless. There's no way. They're lucky that if they have $700, $800, or $900 a month income, they do not have $33,000 a month. And so that low-income housing does them no good.
Well, so why do you think there's not, in your opinion, why do you think there's not more low-cost housing or subsidy for disabled persons? Do you think it's more of a people thing or a government type thing, or both? Or just briefly, what do you think about that as far as the causes of high rents? A little bit more. I know you told us a lot about it, but why do you think there's not more housing or subsidy for disabled persons? Do you think it's a stigma people put on disabled persons, or do you think that matters? What do you think about that? So what the causes?
There needs to be, there obviously is not enough housing for those that are disabled and living on their disability income. And basically, over the last 15 years, there's been a reduction in the subsidized housing in the United States. We have a Section 8 program, a voucher program, which has done wonderful things, but the vouchers are very rare. The county only gets so many vouchers per year, and they don't have enough. They don't have enough for the number of people that are disabled. And so, and Congress controls how many vouchers are allowed every year, and they've been cutting back on their budget year after year. And we need to be heard. The public needs to let their voice be heard, that there is a need for subsidized housing and for more vouchers for those that are disabled, and the people are always wanting to cut the costs, so this is an issue that I'm going to go into more detail next week.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank you so much for what we've talked about. Super, super excellent and important information. And if I can get lucky enough to have you back, you said the next episode or next show, so you guys heard him. I've got him for show number 4. And we still have a lot to discuss and talk about, let people know. So thank you again, Joe. I really appreciate it. Kitsap Homes of Compassion. And as you guys heard, he's going to be back for number 4 when I can get him. Super busy trying to take people off the street. Is that what you do? Something like that? Okay,
yes.
Got you. And so I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Really appreciate it. And thank the viewers for listening, for going to, where's your website again for more information?
KitsapHoc.org. Kitsap Homes of Compassion is KitsapHoc.org.
Okay. And people can check out more of your website as far as how to make donations or other things that you do.
Yes.
More details as far as what's coming up, that type of thing. So, sir, I will see you for episode number 4, hopefully within the next super soon.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.